A man from northern England shared the story online in late 2023. He said he had never believed in ghosts, monsters, or anything supernatural before this happened. To him, those things were just stories people told to scare each other. But after what he experienced in his own backyard, he says he will never sleep peacefully again. The man had recently moved into a small rented house on the outskirts of a quiet town in northern England. It was a simple place. Old brick walls, creaky wooden floors, and a backyard surrounded by a tall wooden fence. Behind the fence, there was nothing but a large empty field and a dark line of trees stretching far into the distance. During the day, the area looked calm and peaceful. But at night, the backyard felt wrong. Too quiet, almost like something was watching from the darkness. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. Then one night around 11 p.m., while he was watching television in the living room, he suddenly heard a loud thud coming from the backyard. Not a small noise. Something heavy hitting the ground. He muted the TV and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then he heard it. Scratching. Slow, dragging scratches against the wooden fence. At first, he assumed it was just an animal. Foxes were common in that area, and sometimes they wandered into backyards looking for food. So he walked to the back door and turned on the porch light. The backyard lit up. But there was nothing there. No animal. No person. The fence looked completely untouched. Confused, he went back inside and ignored it. But the same thing happened the next night. And the night after that. Every single time around 11 p.m. First the loud thud, then the scratching along the fence. After several nights, he started getting curious. So he bought a cheap motion-detecting security camera and placed it facing the backyard. He expected to catch a fox or maybe a stray dog jumping into the yard. But the footage he recorded that night was something he still can't explain. At 10:58 p.m., the motion alert activated. The recording began. For the first few seconds, the yard looked empty. Then suddenly something dropped into the backyard from the other side of the fence. Not climbed. Dropped. Like it had jumped from a high place. The impact was so heavy the camera slightly shook. At first the shape was hard to see. The yard was dark and the figure blended with the shadows. But as it moved slowly across the grass, the man realized something about it looked wrong. Very wrong. The body was thin. Too thin. And the way it moved didn't look like any animal. It was crawling, slowly dragging its arms across the ground, almost like its limbs were too long for its body. Then it stopped in the center of the yard and stayed completely still for nearly 2 full minutes. The man said watching that footage made him extremely uncomfortable. At first, he tried convincing himself it was just a person, maybe a drunk neighbor who had jumped the fence for some reason. But then the figure slowly turned its head, directly toward the camera. Even though the image was dark, he could somehow tell it was staring straight at him. A few seconds later, the motion recording ended. The figure moved out of frame toward the old shed in the corner of the yard, and the video stopped. The man barely slept that night. The next morning, he went outside to check the backyard. He expected to see footprints, or at least signs someone had climbed the fence. But there was nothing. The grass looked untouched. The dirt near the fence had no marks at all. It was like nothing had ever been there. But one thing immediately caught his attention. The shed door. It was slightly open, just a few inches. He was certain it had been closed before. In fact, the landlord had specifically told him not to go inside the shed because it was old and unstable. Still, curiosity got the better of him. He slowly walked toward it. The wind pushed the door slightly, making it creak open a little more. Inside were old gardening tools, broken shelves, and piles of dirt. But the smell was horrible, like something had been rotting inside for weeks. He quickly stepped back and shut the door again, trying to convince himself it was probably just a dead animal. But that night, the camera recorded something again. At 10:59 p.m., motion detection triggered. This time the figure was already inside the backyard, and it was closer to the house. Much closer. The footage showed the same thin shape crawling slowly across the yard. But now the camera captured more detail. Its arms were extremely long. Long enough that they almost touched the ground when it moved. And its movements looked unnatural, jerky, like its joints bent in ways they weren't supposed to. Then suddenly, the creature stood up, slowly, unnaturally tall. at least 7 feet. The man said that was the moment he felt genuine fear, because the creature then turned toward the house, toward the window, toward him. Then it began walking. Step, 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 straight toward the back door. The footage ended just as the creature stopped inches away from the door and tilted its head slightly, like it knew someone inside was watching it. The man tried convincing himself it was just a prank, maybe someone wearing a costume. But the next morning he walked to the back door and immediately froze, because the door handle was covered in long muddy scratch marks, and whatever had been standing outside his house that night had tried to get inside. The man said that after seeing those scratch marks on his back door, he didn't feel safe in the house anymore. The marks were long, far longer than a human fingernail could make. They stretched across the metal handle and into the wood around it, leaving dark muddy streaks like something had grabbed the door and tried to pull it open. He immediately checked the lock. Thankfully, the door was still locked, but the idea that something had stood just inches away from him the night before, trying to get inside, made his stomach turn. At first, he considered calling the police, but what would he even say? That a tall creature had crawled into his backyard? No one would take that seriously, so instead, he decided to do something else. That night, he stayed awake. All the lights in the house were off except the faint glow of the TV, and the security camera was running again. He told himself if the thing came back, he would see it with his own eyes this time. For hours, nothing happened. The clock slowly moved toward 11 p.m., then 10:57 p.m. His heart started beating faster. He kept staring at the backyard through the small window in the kitchen. Everything looked normal. The grass moved gently in the wind. The wooden fence creaked slightly. Then at 10:58 p.m., thud, the exact same heavy sound from the first night. Something had dropped into the yard again. The man froze. For a moment he thought about calling the police immediately, but curiosity kept him standing there. Slowly, carefully, he moved closer to the window and looked outside. At first he didn't see anything. Then something moved near the shed. A tall shape slowly rising from the ground. The creature. Even in the darkness he could clearly see its outline now. It was far too tall to be a normal person. Its arms hung low, almost reaching its knees, and the way its head moved was unnatural, like its neck bent too far to one side. The creature began moving across the yard again, but this time it wasn't crawling. It was walking, slow, uneven steps, like it was still learning how to use its legs. The man felt his chest tighten as he watched it getting closer to the house, closer to the door, closer to him. Then suddenly, the creature stopped, right in the middle of the yard. His head slowly turned toward the house, toward the window where the man was standing. And for the first time, he saw its face, or at least what looked like a face. It was pale, too pale, almost gray in the moonlight. The eyes looked completely dark. No reflection, no cine. Just empty black circles staring directly at the house. The man immediately stepped back from the window, his heart racing. There was no way the creature should have been able to see him through the darkness. But somehow, it felt like it knew he was there. A few seconds later, he heard something outside. Soft footsteps on the grass. Then the sound of something brushing against the back door. He held his breath. The door handle slowly moved, just slightly, like something outside was testing it. The man stood completely still in the kitchen, too scared to move. Then came the scratching again. Slow, dragging scratches across the door, exactly like the ones he had seen that morning. But this time he was hearing them in real life, right outside. The scratching continued for almost 30 seconds. Then suddenly, it stopped. Everything went quiet again. The man waited there for nearly 5 minutes before slowly walking back to the window. When he looked outside, the backyard was empty. The creature was gone. But the next morning something far more disturbing happened. When he opened the back door to check the yard, he noticed the shed door was wide open. Completely open this time. He was sure it had been closed the night before. The dark inside of the shed looked even worse in the daylight. Something about it made his skin crawl, but he forced himself to walk closer. Step by step, the rotten smell hit him before he even reached the door. Stronger than before, much stronger. Holding his breath, he looked inside. Old tools, broken wood, dust, and something else. Deep in the corner of the shed, there was a small hole in the dirt floor, like something had been digging there. The dirt around the hole looked freshly moved, and right beside it, there were long scratch marks, the same type of marks he had seen on the door. The man said that was the moment he realized something terrifying. Whatever had been entering his backyard wasn't just visiting, it had been living there, under the shed. He immediately called his landlord and told him he was moving out. The landlord seemed strangely unsurprised, almost like he had heard something similar before. When the man asked if anyone else had complained about strange things in the backyard, the landlord stayed silent for a few seconds. Then he said something that still haunts the man today. He said, "You're not the first tenant to mention something around that shed." The man packed his things and left that same day. He never went back to that house again. But a few weeks later, he checked the security camera footage one last time before deleting it. And that's when he noticed something he had missed before. On the very first night the creature appeared, right before the video ended, the creature had turned its head toward the shed, and the camera briefly captured the ground behind it. There was another shape in the darkness, another tall figure, standing completely still near the fence, watching the house, which meant the thing in his backyard that night was never alone. Ghost. A man from a small town in southern England shared this experience on a horror forum in 2022. He said he had lived in the same house for nearly 8 years, and during that time nothing unusual had ever happened. The house was normal, quiet neighborhood, friendly neighbors, and a medium-sized backyard with a small garden and an old apple tree in the corner. For years, the backyard had just been a place where he relaxed after work. Sometimes he would sit outside at night, drink tea, and enjoy the silence. But one autumn, something in that backyard changed. And after what happened, he says he will never sit outside at night again. Started with the dog. The man owned a Labrador named Max. Max was normally calm and friendly. He loved being outside and would often run around the backyard chasing insects or digging small holes in the dirt. But one night Max suddenly refused to go outside. It was around 10 p.m. when the man opened the back door to let him out. Instead of running out like usual, Max stopped at the doorway. His ears went back. He stared into the darkness of the yard. Then he slowly backed away from the door. At first the man laughed. He thought maybe the dog saw a fox or a cat. But the next night the exact same thing happened again. And the night after that, Max refused to step into the backyard after dark. Instead he would stand at the door, staring outside, quietly growling. The man began noticing something else too. Late at night he sometimes heard strange sounds coming from the backyard. Very faint, like something moving through the grass. At first he ignored it. Animals sometimes wandered into the garden. But the sounds became more frequent, and they always happened very late at night, usually between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. One night the man woke up suddenly after hearing a loud thump outside, like something heavy had landed in the yard. Half asleep, he walked to the window and looked outside. The backyard was dark. The only light came from the street lamp beyond the fence. For a few seconds he didn't see anything. Then something moved near the apple tree. A shadow shifted slowly across the ground. At first he assumed it was a fox, but the shape looked too large, and it was moving, strangely, not running, not walking, more like it was dragging itself across the grass. The man felt uneasy watching it, but before he could focus on it properly, the shape disappeared behind the garden shed. He stayed at the window for a few minutes, but nothing else happened. Eventually he went back to bed. The next morning he went outside to check the garden. At first everything looked normal. Then he noticed something unusual near the apple tree. The grass was flattened, like something heavy had been lying there. Right in the center of the flattened grass, there was a hole in the dirt. A deep hole, at least a foot wide. It looked freshly dug. The man assumed an animal had made it, maybe a fox digging for food. So he filled the hole with soil and forgot about it. But 2 nights later, the hole appeared again, in the exact same place. This time it was deeper, and the dirt around it looked like it had been pushed out from below. That detail bothered him, because it didn't look like something had dug into the ground. It looked like something had dug out of it. That night he placed a motion camera facing the apple tree. He expected to catch a fox digging the hole again. But the footage he captured was something far more disturbing. At 2:43 a.m., the motion alert activated. The backyard looked empty. The wind gently moved the branches of the apple tree. Then suddenly, the ground moved. The dirt around the hole shifted slightly. Then slowly, something pushed its way up from inside the hole. At first it looked like a hand. A long pale arm slowly emerging from the dirt. The man said watching that footage made his blood run cold. The arm looked thin and almost human, but the fingers were too long, too thin. One by one they gripped the edge of the hole. Then a second arm appeared. Whatever it was, it slowly pulled itself out of the ground. The camera captured a tall figure climbing from the hole. His body was covered in dirt. Its movements were slow and unnatural, like something that had never walked properly before. When it finally stood up, it was extremely tall, at least 7 feet. The creature turned its head slowly, scanning the backyard. The man said the most disturbing part was the way it moved. Every motion looked stiff and jerky, like its bones bent the wrong way. For several minutes, the creature simply walked around the yard, touching the grass, touching the apple tree, almost like it was exploring the surface. Then suddenly it stopped. His head slowly turned toward the house, toward the window where the man was sleeping. Even though the lights inside were off, the creature stared directly at the house. For nearly 30 seconds it didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then slowly, it walked back to the hole, lowered itself into the darkness, and disappeared underground again. The next morning the man checked the garden in daylight. The hole was there, exactly like in the video. He tried convincing himself it was a prank. Maybe someone digging into the yard somehow. But there was something he couldn't explain. The hole went straight down, almost like a tunnel. And the deeper he looked into it, the darker it became. That night he decided to stay awake and watch the yard himself. At around 2:40 a.m., he was sitting in the living room with the lights off, waiting. The house was completely silent. Then suddenly, he heard something, a faint scratching sound, coming from beneath the floor, directly under the living room. The man froze, because the hole outside was located right behind that wall. The scratching sound grew louder, slow, dragging, moving through the ground. Then suddenly, there was a loud thud outside in the backyard, like something heavy had jumped out of the hole again. The man slowly walked to the window, his hands shaking, and when he looked outside, the creature was already standing in the middle of the yard. But this time it wasn't exploring. This time, it was facing the house, completely still. And then something even worse happened. The creature slowly lifted its arm and pointed directly at the window, at him. The man said he moved out of that house 2 days later. But before leaving, he checked the hole one final time. It was gone, completely gone. The dirt had collapsed back into place, like it had never existed. But sometimes late at night, he still wonders something terrifying. If the creature could come out of that hole, it also means something had been living under his house the entire time. Ghost. This story was shared by a man from Manchester, England in 2021. He said that even today he still refuses to watch the footage again, because whatever appeared in his backyard that night was something he cannot explain. The man had moved into a small semi-detached house with his wife and young daughter. The house itself was normal, but the backyard was large and surrounded by an old wooden fence that looked like it had been there for decades. Behind that fence there was a narrow, empty alley, and then a row of tall trees that blocked most of the streetlight. During the day, the yard looked harmless, but at night, the entire place became extremely dark, almost pitch black. The family lived there peacefully for about 6 months. Nothing strange happened, until the night their security camera started recording something unusual. The man had installed the camera after a few neighbors complained about people sneaking through the alley late at night. He didn't think much of it. It was just a simple motion-detecting camera pointing toward the backyard. For weeks, the camera recorded nothing except the occasional cat or fox. But one night around 3:12 a.m., the motion alert activated. The footage showed the backyard under the faint glow of the porch light. At first, everything looked normal. The grass moved slightly in the wind. The fence cast long shadows across the ground. Then something moved near the far corner of the yard. At first it looked like a shadow shifting across the grass. But the shadow moved against the direction of the wind. Slowly, something tall stepped into the frame. The man said the moment he saw it his stomach dropped, because the shape looked almost human, but far too tall, at least 7 feet. His body looked extremely thin, and its arms hung unusually low, almost reaching its knees. The figure slowly walked across the backyard, but the way it moved looked wrong. The steps were stiff, unnatural, like its joints bent in directions they shouldn't. For several seconds it just wandered across the yard. Then it suddenly stopped. His head slowly turned toward the house, directly toward the camera. Even though the image was dark, it felt like the figure was staring straight through the screen. The footage ended there. At first the man assumed it was someone playing a prank. Maybe a tall person wearing a costume. But when he checked the yard the next morning, there were no footprints. No signs anyone had climbed the fence. Nothing. The grass looked untouched. Still, he brushed it off and forgot about it. Until 2 nights later. At 3:07 a.m., the camera recorded movement again. This time the figure appeared almost immediately, standing near the fence, completely still. The man said the strangest part was that it hadn't walked into the yard. It was just already there when the footage started, standing motionless in the darkness. For nearly a full minute it didn't move. Then suddenly, it began walking again. But this time it walked toward something. Toward the children's swing hanging from a small metal frame in the yard. The swing slowly moved in the wind. The figure stepped closer to it, then gently pushed it. The swing began rocking back and forth. Slowly. The man said that moment terrified him, because his daughter loved playing on that swing during the day. And seeing that tall figure touching it in the middle of the night made his skin crawl. But what happened next was even worse. The figure suddenly stopped moving. Then its head turned toward the house again, toward the bedroom window where the family slept. The man noticed something strange in the footage. The head didn't turn normally, tilted too far, far beyond what a human neck should allow. Almost like the bones inside it weren't structured the same way. The figure then took several slow steps toward the house, and stopped directly in front of the back door. For several seconds it stood there, not moving, just staring at the door. Then the camera captured something chilling. The figure slowly raised its arm and touched the door. Its fingers moved across the surface like it was feeling the shape of the house. The footage ended seconds later. When the man woke up that morning, he checked the back door immediately, and what he saw made his chest tighten. There were long scratch marks across the wood, exactly where the figure had touched it. At that point, he finally called the police. He showed them the footage, but they couldn't identify what the figure was. One officer suggested it might be someone in a costume. Another thought it might be a tall trespasser. But none of them could explain one detail. The fence around the backyard was nearly 8 feet tall, and there were no marks showing anyone had climbed over it. The officers left after checking the area. Nothing else happened for a few days. Then one night something far worse occurred. At 3:14 a.m., the camera recorded movement again. But this time the footage started differently. Instead of the yard, the camera first captured the back door slowly opening, just a few inches from the outside. The man said his heart nearly stopped when he saw that part, because that meant something had been standing right outside the door. Opening it, the door slowly creaked wider. Then the tall figure stepped into view. But now the camera captured it much closer than before, and the details were horrifying. Its skin looked pale and stretched tightly across its body. Its arms were far longer than a human's. But the worst part was the face, or what should have been a face, because instead of normal features, it looked almost blank, flat, with 2 dark holes where the eyes should be. The figure stood in the doorway for several seconds. Then it did something the man will never forget. It leaned forward slightly and looked directly into the house, as if checking whether someone was inside. Then suddenly, the figure stepped back. Its head quickly turned toward the alley behind the yard, like it had heard something. Within seconds it walked away and disappeared into the darkness. The man woke up the next morning to find the back door slightly open, exactly like in the footage. After that night, the family moved out immediately. They never returned to that house again. But weeks later, the man received a message from one of his old neighbors. The neighbor said the new family who moved into the house had installed security cameras as well. And only 3 nights after moving in, their backyard camera captured something strange. A tall, thin figure, standing near the swing, watching the house, completely motionless, like it was waiting for someone inside to notice it. Ghost.